Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Now we will discuss Bhakti Rasa. Bhakti Rasa was philosophically and poetically established in literary and religious practices of medieval India. It was appeared as so popular that entire India was engaged with this rasa. The philosophical understanding of this thought also was reached to the common people, and it was adopted by them. Bhakti movement, mainly it was spreaded over 800th century to 1700th century, originated from South India, was circulated to the north, west, east and northeastern part of India gradually. It gave birth of massive number of literature, which were mostly the poems and songs used to be performed either in temple, dargahs, gurudwar or at the places of the common mass. The leaders of this movement came across the language, class, caste and religion. Alwar, Nayanmars, Jains of Kannada, Dadu, Kabir, Tukaram, Namdev, Mirabai, Chaitanya Dev, all these figures were mass leaders, philosophers or poets in their own language and region, and also had shaken the philosophical thoughts beyond their linguistic, religious and cultural boundary, linguistic, religious and cultural identity. The literature which was emerged not directly from this movement also was very much influenced by this movement. Bhakti movement, as we understand from the very title of the movement, actually was centered by the Bhakti Bhava of the devotees to get, to meet, to be one with the God or with whom they worship. The translation practice of medieval India, like the translation of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, also was very much influenced by this Bhakti movement and all this culture of Bhakti Rasa. The entire translation of the Ramayana, Mahabharata, even the translation of Purana, all and Bhagavata were very much influenced with Bhakti Rasa. So we can find the Bhakti Rasa not only in the poetry or songs of the Bhakti leaders, but also those poets who are not directly engaged with the Bhakti movement but were very much influenced by Bhakti movement, and they created Bhakti Rasa in their translation of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavata and Purana. A historian and a literary historian and famous linguist Sukumar Sen argues that Krittivasha's Bengali Ramayana was influenced by the Bhakti Rasa, which was enhanced by the powerful influence of Chaitanya Dev. Madhav Kandali's Bhakti Rasa was Vishnu Bhakti Rasa, and Madhav Kandali is very much famous in the practice of Vaishnavism and the Ramayana in Assamese language. Krishna Bhakti of Bhagavata became Vaishnava Krishna Bhakti in translation in the post-Chaitanya era. Although translations into Bengali had begun earlier to Chaitanya, such translation increased in number and value in post-Chaitanya era, and not only in Bengali translation, but the translation of Ramayana, Mahabharata and the Bhagavata all over India in modern Indian languages were influenced by Bhakti Rasa. It may be the Krishna Bhakti, it may be the Vishnu Bhakti, it may be the Bhakti of Shaktas. The Oxford Anthology of Bhakti Literature, edited by Andrew Skilling, in its introduction on Bhakti poetry, explains the origin and history of Bhakti movement in India and its relation with vernacular literature and culture. I found this noteworthy to refer in this module, mainly analyzed the political aspect of Bhasha and tried to read the medieval society from the political viewpoint. But that is not the only reality of medieval Indian literature which made translation inevitable. Bhakti movement engaged the people across class, caste and religion and successfully endorsed people's language and spirituality. So because of that, the Bhakti philosophy and Bhakti Rasa to some extent reached to the very ground level of the society, and people they were engaged with the Bhakti Rasa and Bhakti philosophy, and they identified themselves with the whole Bhakti movement. Skilling comments, driven by spiritual hunger, a fierce desire for spiritual freedom and long-simmering demands for social and economic equality, Bhakti poets issued forth in dozens of languages, I unquote. This was not only about the social and economic equality, but also about the cultural equality and right to knowledge. Bhakti movement and Bhasha culture synthesized people's belief and people's literature, which was there in oral tradition and in local language, with the philosophical and religious thoughts which are found in scriptures and classical texts. Medieval translation always carried the traces of raw vernacular vocabulary, riddles, secret codes and non-rational images, which shows the deep affinity between the translation and social life, which further ensures that translation reached its target audience. And the same way, not only the translated literature, the Bhakti literature reached the people. And moreover, we can say that the way translation reached to the people, that way was made previously with the Bhakti movement and Bhakti culture. The texts which were translated during medieval period not only tried to bring knowledge from Sanskrit and later from the Persian text, but also tried to express spirituality in people's language. And this context is very much significant to understand the practice of Bhakti literature, Bhakti philosophy and Bhakti Rasa, because the whole Bhakti philosophy has its relation with the Vedic culture, with the scriptures. It is not completely disconnected from those culture or from those literature. And later on we can see the influence of Sufism and the practitioners of Bhakti Rasa or Bhakti philosophy. Many of them were very much influenced by the Sufism, and they accepted Sufism as their way of life, and that way of life, the philosophy of life, also reflected in poetry. So the whole culture of translation of literature from Sanskrit and from Persian in medieval era is also related with the culture of Bhakti movement. Though Bhakti movement had emerged much before the translation practice had been started, but later on, when translation practice from Sanskrit and Persian started, this translation practice helps Bhakti movement to be continued, to be flourished, and Bhakti movement already helped the translation practice to reach to the people, because we cannot understand this Bhakti Rasa and the people's relation with it if we reject this translation culture of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and many other texts from Persian. According to scaling, Bhakti poetry occurs at the confluence of Sanskrit with India's vernacular traditions. Bhakti and the poems that convey its passions are, in A.K. Ramanujan's words, deliberately anti-tradition. The motivation for the development of Bhasha was to oppose religious hierarchy and politics of knowledge restriction within a certain caste and class. It also sought to satisfy people's desire for spirituality. Bhakti Baba of the creative poets and translators' mind for the selection, translation, and circulation of particular text. Krittivas's popularity and wide circulation of his manuscript was due to his Bhakti Bhava onwards Vaishnavism and his devotion to that culture, and his location of is very much important here, that why Krittivasa was so popular among the translator of the Ramayana in Bengal, because his native place was very much near to the Navadvip, which was the center of Vaishnavite movement and the center of study of Vaishnavite philosophy. The Alaul's Padmavati, another Bengali text of medieval Bengal, which was a court literature, and that Padmavati was very much influenced by Alaul's knowledge and belief on Sufism, which also made this translated text acceptable to the Bengali community, mostly especially among the Muslims. Skilling adapts Dilip Chitra's term to describe the literary productions of Bhakti movement as orature. Skilling also comments that Bhakti is oral poetry, orature, not literature, enunciated by the poet and written onto the page only later, often centuries later. In this sense, its natural habitat has always been performance. As we can find the Bhakti poets, saint poets, and the leaders of Bhakti movement, they always performed their philosophy in the art form. They used to perform the music, they used to dance, they used to perform the poems. So there is a deepest relation between the creation of Bhakti movement and the literary creation of Bhakti movement and the performative culture. In the Bengali scenario, Bhakti was not only expressed in the performative or the oral tradition, but was in written forms also, as in other cultures. It was a happy marriage between written culture and oral tradition, as local was reflected in the pages of the manuscripts which were adapted by the Kathak Thakurs to perform. Bhakti and Bhasha were determining factors for the birth of medieval Indian literature, medieval Indian mass consciousness and mass participation in the high thought of philosophy and the high thought of practice of communal harmony through literature, through religious practice, and through performance. According to Scaling, there are 6 characteristics of Bhakti poetry as follows. The first one is, the poem is carried by the poet's voice. It has been composed orally, sometimes spontaneously. Second, a highly developed process of thinking in images. Third, a minimal art of maximum involvement or intensity. Fourth, listeners or spectators, these are public events. The poet creates a theater of participants, willing or unwilling. So, audience has immense participation in this performance. Performance is not one-sided in Bhakti culture. Fifth, animal body rootedness. The poem is an act of both body and spirit. It is not only the work of spirit or not only the work of body, but in this performance of Bhakti text, body and spirit works together. Poet as shaman, he or she is controller of the techniques of ecstasy. When I argue that Bhakti and Bhasha are intrinsically related in creation of literature, Indian literature, I mean the spiritual, cultural, social environment of the time with the surfeit of Bhakti Bhava made the literature and translation possible. It is not about the Bhakti poets who translated or not always about their direct influence which made the translation or literary creation possible, but it is about the entire cultural environment. It is not only about Mira, Kabir, Tukaram, Dadu or Chaitanya Dev whose influence directly opened the possibility of creation of new translated literature which are influenced by Bhakti movement, but the environment which was created by the Bhakti movement or people's spiritual desire towards Bhakti that made this possible. The history of medieval translation shows the force of Bhakti and its philosophical foundation, strengthened by the patronage of kings and later sultans, helped the translation and further work of literature in different regions of India. Another point to be noted is that the translators were not necessarily Bhakti poets as the above characteristics list, but they were certainly driven by Bhakti Bhava. And that is very important to create the Bhakti Rasa in their literature or in their translation. I very specifically emphasize on translation in this context because this translation of the Ramayana, Mahabharata or any Sufi text was not only the translation for the elite class or for the only literate society, but these texts, like the direct text created from the Bhakti movement, these texts also were very much performative. The Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the story were used to be told. The story of Padmavati or Padumavats was used to be told, used to be performed in the folk theatre form, in folk dance form, in folk musical form. So this medieval translation is very much identical with the literary text directly produced by Bhakti movement. Scaling adds, Bhakti poetry occurs at the confluence of Sanskrit with India's vernacular tradition. But the influence of Bhakti was not only limited within this culture of Sanskrit, the influence of Sufism led the work of literature or oral tradition to the reach of the people. And furthermore, we can find the Bhakti Rasa which was influenced by Shakta philosophy or Shaivite philosophy. We can find that the poets like Ramprasad Sen, Kamalakanta Bhattacharya, who are the devotees of Kali, they also helped the development of Bhasha and Bhakti Rasa through their songs, their poems and musical performances. Now, let us concentrate on Rupa Goswami and his Bhakti Rasa. Rupa Goswami, one of the greatest Vaishnavite philosophers, is considered most talented and most talented scholar to contribute in the context of Bhakti Rasa, because he theorized the concept of Bhakti Rasa. In his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Rupa Goswami is very much, this text of Rupa Goswami is very much critical study on the Bhakti poetry. It was composed during first quarter of 16th century and it was one of his almost 20 books on literature and philosophy. Though this book is written into Sanskrit, but it talks about the poetry which were written in Indian languages. Though this text was written in Sanskrit, he was talking about the poems and poets of his contemporary. Rupa Goswami had keen interest about the poetry written in his own time. Ganesh Devi commented in this context that Rupa Goswami was not trying to explain Bhakti poetry in terms of the rasa theory as much as he was trying to explain the rasa theory in terms of Bhakti poetry as rooted in poetic practice in his own time. According to Devi, Goswami observed Bhakti as highest rasa because it brings an experience to the Rashika which is aesthetically superior than Brahmananda. Goswami reflected upon the idea of Bhakti and its psychology. Even though there are so many great acharyas, Rupa Goswami had been attributed with the honor of being that person who had established the Manovistam, the innermost heart's desire of Sri Krishna in the form of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. When Sriman Mahaprabhu came to the village of Ramakeli Gram, he met with Rupa Goswami and Sanatan Goswami and told them, "You should leave your homes and be with me." After a short time, they left their homes and Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu came from Vrindavan and met with Rupa Goswami at Prayag, the confluence of the rivers Yamuna and Ganga, and Chaitanya Prabhu told them, "Para parasanya gabhira bhakti rasa sindhu, tamaya chakite tara kahi eka bindu." The ocean of the transcendental mellows of devotional service is so large that no one can estimate its length and breadth. However, just to help you test it, I am describing one drop. Lord Chaitanya gave one drop of the ocean of rasa to Rupa Goswami, and that one drop was sufficient to inundate millions upon millions of universe. Later, he met with Sanatan Goswami in Varanasi. Rupa Goswami thought, in order to fulfill the innermost heart's desire of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, I will write a drama. In this drama, I will explain the beauty of the meeting pastimes of Srimati Radhika and Sri Krishna in Vrindavana, and also the separation pastimes. When Lord Krishna leaves Vrindavana and goes to Mathura and Dwaraka, I will explain how, by their expansions, Srimati Radhika and all the Shakhis somehow or other went to Dwaraka and became Lord Krishna's 16,108 queens. He intended to write about this, but while he was travelling towards Jagannatha Puri, he came to the village of Satyabhamapura. There Srimati Satyabhama Devi, Lord Krishna's chief queen, appeared to him in a dream and told him, "Please don't make this only one drama, rather divide it into two parts." Rupa Goswami was not only theorist of Bhakti Baba, as we mentioned, that he was author of almost 20 books on literature and philosophy, and he has equal scholarship on creation of literature and the theory and the theoretical discussion of literature and the philosophical thought. The Ujjwal Nilmani, which is another famous theoretical text written by Rupa Goswami, which talks about Madhura Baba. But the Bhakti Baba and Bhakti Rasa is actually well elaborated, and the philosophical ground, the philosophy and psychology of readers and devotees' minds is described, analyzed, scientifically analyzed in his text when he talks about Bhakti Rasa. So the Bhakti Rasa, what is 1,000 years old, and it is when Rupa Goswami was writing his text on Bhakti Rasa. Already Bhakti Rasa had been practicing since different practitioners, poets and saints in India, and Rupa Goswami actually had a study of all this tradition and the ancestors' creation, and he scientifically analyzed it, and he presented a very well formulated theoretical understanding of Bhakti Rasa. And to do this, as we mentioned earlier, to him, his contemporary poets, his contemporary poems in Indian languages, and Bhakti movement and Bhakti poetry was his main concern. He was not using the rasa to understand the Bhakti poetry, but Bhakti poetry helped him to understand the rasa, and this is how he became the most celebrated scholar who talks about Bhakti Rasa. The elaborate study on Bhakti Rasa, Bhakti movement and Rupa Goswami, you can find the e-text and all the references, bibliography, everything you can find in e-text. And for conclusion, we can say this, that there is a long tradition of Bhakti movement and creation of Bhakti literature, and Bhakti Rasa is actually sustained since a long time in Indian philosophical, religious and literary practices, and Rupa Goswami is that one exceptional theorist who has theorized the Bhakti Rasa and Bhakti Bhava. Thank you.